Suppose that truth is a woman, and why not? Aren't there reasons for suspecting that all philosophers, to the extent that they have been dogmaticists, have not really understood women? That the grotesque seriousness of their approach towards the truth and the clumsy advances that they have made so far are unsuitable ways of pressing their suit with a woman? What is certain is that she has spurned them, leaving dogmatism of all types standing sad and discouraged, if it is even left standing. Because there are those who make fun of dogmatism, claiming that it has fallen over, that it is lying flat on its face, or more, that dogmatism is in its last gasps. But seriously, there are good reasons for hoping that all dogmatizing in philosophy was just noble, though childish, ambling and preambling, however solemn, settled, and decisive it might have seemed. And perhaps the time is very near when we realize again and again just what actually served as the cornerstone of those sublime and unconditional philosophical edifices, and that dogmatists used to build some piece of folk superstition from time immemorial, like the sole superstition that still causes trouble as the superstition of the subject or eye, some wordplay, perhaps a seduction of grammar, or an over-originalization from facts that are really very local, very personal, very human, all too human. Let us hope that the dogmatist's philosophy was only a promise over the millennia, as was the case even earlier with astrology, in those whose service perhaps more labor, money, ingenuity, and patience was expended than for any real science so far. We owe the great style of architecture in Asia and Egypt to astrology and its supernatural claims. It seems that all great things, in order to inscribe eternal demands with the heart of humanity, must first wander the earth under monstrous and terrifying masks. Dogmatic philosophy was a sort of a mask. The Vendetta doctrine in Asia, for example, or Platonism in Europe. We should not be ungrateful toward dogmaticism, but it must nonetheless be said that the worst, most prolonged, and most dangerous of all errors to this day was a dogmaticist error, namely Plato's invention of pure spirit and the good in itself. But now that it has been overcome, and Europe breathes a sigh of relief after this nightmare, and at least can enjoy a healthier, well, sleep. We, whose task is wakefulness itself, are the heirs to all force cultivated through the struggle against this error. Of course, talking about spirit and the good like Plato did meant standing truth on its head and disowning even perspectivism, which is the fundamental condition of all life. In fact, as physicians, we could ask, how could such a disease infect Plato, the most beautiful outgrowth of antiquity? Did the evil Socrates corrupt him after all? Was Socrates in fact the corrupter of youth? Did he deserve his hemlock? With the struggle against Plato, or to use a clear and popular idiom, the struggle against the Christian ecclesiastical pressure of millennia, since Christianity is Platonism for the people, has created a magnificent tension of spirit in Europe, the likes of which the earth has never known. With such a tension in our bow, we can now shoot at the furthest goals. Granted, the European experiences this tension as a crisis or state of need, and twice already there have been attempts in a grand fashion to unbend the bow, once through Jesuitism, the second time through the democratic enlightenment, which, with the help of freedom, the press, and circulation of newspapers, might really ensure the spirit does not experience itself so readily as need. Germans invented gunpowder, all honors due, but they made up for it. They invented the press. But we, who were neither Jesuits nor Democrats nor even German enough, we good Europeans and free, very free spirits, we still have it. The whole need of spirit and the whole tension of its bow, and perhaps the arrow too. Yeah, it's bow, sorry. The task and, who knows, the goal. Part 1 on prejudices of philosophers. The will to truth that still seduces us into taking so many risks, this famous truthfulness that all philosophers so far have talked about with veneration. What questions this will to truth has already laid before us. What strange, terrible, questionable questions. That is already a long story, and yet it seems to have already begun. Is it any wonder if we finally become suspicious, lose patience, turn impatiently away? That we ourselves are also learning from the Sphinx to pose questions. Who is it really that questions us here? What in us really wills the truth? In fact, we paused for a long time before the question of the cause of this will, until we finally came to a complete standstill in front of an even more fundamental question. We asked about the value of this will. Granted, we will the truth. Why not untruth instead? Uncertainty, even ignorance. The problem of the value of truth came before us, or was it we who came before the problem? Which of us is Oedipus? Which of one is the Sphinx? It seems we have a rendezvous of questions and question marks, and believe it or not, it ultimately looks to us as if the problem has never been raised until now, as if we were the first to ever see it, fix our gaze on it, risk it. Because this involves risk, and perhaps no risk has ever been greater. How could anything originate out of its opposite? Truth from error, for instance, or the will to truth from the will to deception, or selfless action from self-interest, or the pure, sun-bright gaze of wisdom from a covetous leer. Such origins are impossible, and the people who dream about such things are fools, at best. Things of the highest value must have another separate origin of their own. They cannot be derived from this ephemeral separate origin of their own. They cannot be derived from this deceptive lowly world, from this mad chaos of confusion and desire. Look instead to the lap of being, the everlasting, the hidden God, the thing in itself. This is where their ground must be, and nowhere else. This way of judging typifies the prejudices by which metaphysicians of all ages can be recognized. This type of valuation lies behind all their logical procedures. From these beliefs, they try to acquire their knowledge, to acquire something that will end up being solemnly christened as the truth. The fundamental belief of metaphysicians is the belief in opposites of values. It has not occurred to even the most cautious of them to start doubting right here at the threshold where it is actually needed the most. Even though they have vowed to themselves de omnibus dubitandum. But we can doubt, first, whether opposites even exist, and second, whether the popular valuations and value oppositions that have earned the metaphysician's seal of approval might not only be foreground appraisals. Perhaps they are merely provisional perspectives, perhaps they are not even viewed head-on, perhaps they are even viewed from below, like a frog perspective, to borrow an expression that painters will recognize. Whatever value might be attributed to truth, truthfulness, and selflessness, it could be possible that appearance, the will to deception, and craven self-interest should be accorded a higher and more fundamental value for all life. It could even be possible that whatever gives value to the good and honorable things has an incriminating link, bond, or tie to the very things that look like their evil opposites. Perhaps they are even essentially the same, perhaps, but who is willing to take charge of such a dangerous perhaps? For this we must await the arrival of a new breed of philosophers, one whose taste and inclination are somehow the reverse of those we have seen so far. Philosophers of the dangerous, perhaps in even every sense. And in all seriousness, I see these new philosophers approaching. I have kept a close eye on the philosophers and read between their lines for long enough to say to myself, the greatest part of conscious thought must still be attributed to the instinctive activity, and this is even the case for philosophical thought. This issue needs re-examination in the same way that heredity and innate characteristics have been re-examined. Just as the act of birth makes no difference to the overall course of heredity, neither is consciousness opposed to instinct in any decisive sense. Most of a philosopher's conscious thought is secretly directed and forced into determinate channels by the instincts. Even behind all logic and its autocratic posturing stand valuations, or stated more clearly, physiological requirements for the preservation of a particular type of life. For example, that the determinate is worth more than the indeterminate, appearance worth less than the truth, despite all the regulative importance for us. These sorts of appraisals could still be just foreground appraisals, a particular type of niaiserie, precisely what is needed for the preservation of beings like us. But this assumes that it is not man who is the measure of things. We do not consider the falsity of a judgment as itself an objection to a judgment. This is perhaps where our new language will sound most foreign. The question is how far the judgment promotes and preserves life, how well it preserves and perhaps even cultivates the type. And we are fundamentally inclined to claim that the falsest judgments, which include synthetic judgments a priori, are the most indispensable to us. and that without accepting the fictions of logic, without measuring reality against the wholly invented world of the unconditioned and self-identical, without a constant falsification of the world through numbers, people could not live. That a renunciation of false judgments would be renunciation of life, a negation of life. To acknowledge untruth as a condition of life, this clearly means resisting the usual value feelings in a dangerous manner. And a philosophy that risks such a thing would be, by that gesture alone, place itself beyond good and evil. What good goads us into regarding all philosophers with an equal measure of mistrust and mockery is not that we struck repeatedly by how innocent they are, how often and easily they err and stray short their childish childlikeness, but rather that there is not enough genuine honesty about them, even though they all make a huge virtuous racket as soon as the problem of truthfulness is even remotely touched upon. They all act as if they had discovered and derived their genuine convictions through the self-development of a cold, pure, divinely insouciant dialect, in contrast to the mystics of every rank who are more honest than the philosophers and also sillier than talk about inspiration. Well, what essentially happens is that they take a conjecture, a whim, an inspiration, or more typically, they take from some fervent wish that they have sifted through and made properly abstract, and they defend it with rationalizations after the fact. They are all advocates who do not want to be seen as such. For the most part, in fact, they are sly spokesmen for prejudices that they are christened as truth, and very far indeed from the courage of conscience that confesses to this fact, and this very fact, and very far from having the good taste of courage. And also let this be known, perhaps to warn a friend, foe, or out of a high-spirited attempt at self-satire. The stiff yet demure tartuffery used by the old cant to lure us along the clandestine dialectical path that leads to the way, or rather astray, to his categorical imperative. This spectacle provides no small amusement for discriminating spectators like us who keep a close eye on the cunning tricks of the old moralists, that preachers of morals, or even that hocus-pocus of a mathematical form used by Spinoza to arm and outfit his philosophy, a term which, when all is said and done, really means his love of wisdom, and thus from the very start to strike terror into the heart of an attacker who would dare to glance at the unconquerable maiden and Pallas Athena. How much personal timidity and vulnerability his sick hermit's masquerade reveals.